I'm Rachel Anderson. I'm the Director of Corporate Affairs here at RECCo, and I'll be the facilitator for the webinar today. In terms of the purpose of today, we'll be discussing our draft strategy and forward work plan for 2024 to 2027 with you. It was published for consultation at the beginning of last week, so that was the 15th of January. And it's currently open to consultation for the next 15 working days, with responses due on the 5th of February. So today's webinar really does serve as a key platform for our engagement with you in terms of our strategic roadmap for the next year and beyond. And we'll be using today's session to walk you through the key elements of the forward work plan. Really importantly, we want to hear from you today, and it's a chance for you to interact and ask your questions, and also share any thoughts or initial feedback on the forward work plan with us and the rest of the executive team who will be our speakers for today. I do hope you can also use today's webinar to help inform your consultation responses with us over the next couple of weeks. Just a point to note, all feedback, whether it's through the webinar today or through the formal consultation window, will be considered before the board publishes its final version of our forward work plan for 2024-2027, which will be towards the end of March, ahead of the next financial year. If you haven't had a chance to look at our forward work plan and strategy document so far, don't worry. As I said, today we will be walking you through all the key components of our plans for the year ahead and beyond. So just in terms of some housekeeping, a few points to note from me before we look at our speakers and the main agenda for today. So we have kept cameras and microphones switched off today. That is because we are recording today's session for the benefit of colleagues that couldn't join us today. So following the webinar today, we'll be sharing the recording, slides, collation of any questions and comments received today with you guys on Thursday. We'll also be placing the recording of our webinar on both RECCo's website and our YouTube channel. So that's why we're just keeping microphones and cameras off. We do really want to encourage your questions and your feedback in today's session. So although we've turned off the chat function, and that's purely because of the sheer number of registered attendees for today, please do ask your questions as you have them through the Q&A function within the Microsoft Teams event. You should see that on the top panel. We'll be keeping an eye on those questions, and then I'll be asking the speakers to come back on camera at the end of the session, and then we'll walk through those questions. We have left a good proportion of time for questions today, but if we don't get through all of them, we'll be collating them and circulating those questions and answers with everyone who attended and registered for today. The last bit of housekeeping from me is just really a reminder, just please do keep your questions relevant, and that avoids any referencing of any of our organisations, please. So Jenny, if we could go on to the next slide, have a look at our speakers for today. Perfect, that's caught up. So who are our speakers today? So I'm really pleased to say that I'm joined by the rest of the executive team here at RECCo. So we have Sid Cox, our RECCo's Chief Executive, who'll be starting things off once I've done the initial introductions. We'll then be hearing from Elizabeth Lawler, as our Director of Operations, Tracy Hardy, our Interim Director of Data and Digitalisation, John Dixon as our Director of Strategy and Development, Jonathan Hawkins as our Interim Director of Operational Programmes, and also Brian O'Shea as our Director of Finance and Commercial. So that's our speakers. What can you expect in terms of the agenda today? So if we could go on to the next slide, please, Jenny. In terms of the agenda, we've purposely designed the webinar to follow the key sections of the forward work plan. So that really aligns to our focus as an organisation over the coming year. And we hope that the webinar layout helps you with your reading and reviewing of the document, and therefore your responses to our consultation. So the first slot will be Sid. Sid will be doing a bit of a recap in terms of RECCo and looking at our progress and plans. And this is where we'll hear the four key strategic priorities for the first time for RECCo. We'll then be moving on to a bit of a deep dive and an overview into our strategic priorities. So that is delivering service excellence, RECCo's data and digitalisation strategy, RECCo's energy theft reduction strategy, and the regulatory programmes and policy initiatives that either RECCo will be involved in over the coming year and beyond, or what we're keeping a watching brief on. So after those areas of our forward work plan, Brian will then give us an overview of RECCo's 3-year financial projections, which were included in the back end of our forward work plan. And then that will conclude the main speakers' presentations today. And then I'll be doing a bit of a next steps, reminding you of some key dates for the diaries, the consultation process that we're currently in, and how that will feed into our final publication of our budget in February, and also our final publication of our strategy and forward work plan in March. We have left a good proportion of time for a Q&A session, so please do keep your questions coming through the Q&A function within Microsoft Teams. We'll be keeping an eye on those and then getting through as many questions as we can at the end of the session. So that's all from me for now. I really do hope you find today useful. Please engage with us, please interact with us. But in the meantime, I'll pass over to you, Sid, to provide an overview of RECCo and our progress and plans. Over to you, Sid.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rachel. Hopefully you can all see me. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you today and to share with you at a high level our progress and plans for our forward work plan. If we can move on, you will know by now that our mission at RECCo is to facilitate the efficient and effective running of the retail energy market, including its systems and processes, and to promote innovation, competition, and delivering positive consumer outcomes. Importantly, by living our values, we are striving to achieve outcomes for what we describe as our 5 C's for the retail energy market. Consumers, as I said earlier, we're promoting positive outcomes. For climate, assisting everyone in the journey towards net zero. Competition, making sure that in what we do, there is a level playing field for all participants. Cost, ensuring we deliver value for money and catalysing change, facilitating faster change and innovation throughout the market. You will see our contribution to these promoted outcomes against each of our deliverables in the forward work plan. So a little bit about RECCo. Our role at RECCo is to manage and evolve the Retail Energy Code and the delivery of core services such as the inquiry services and more recently the central registration service, which are used by industry on a daily basis, as well as the overall code manager service. We're also called upon to solve other industry issues and to deliver the administration of energy market schemes like the market stabilisation charge and from April this year, the levelisation scheme. We do this through a predominantly outsourced delivery model where we design, procure and manage services by holding our service providers to account. I joined RECCo almost 3 years ago when we started consolidated the legacy codes and mobilising the team and our first services. It has always been our objective to provide you, our stakeholders, with an excellent service. Last July saw our first year of full service operation, so it was important for us to take stock and to listen to your feedback, both through our RECCo on the road roadshows during the summer and through the annual stakeholder survey in the autumn. It's fair to say that while the overall feedback of our service is good, and there are some services which you really highly value, like the inquiry services, this is not consistently the case. We have listened to your feedback and we will address service issues to the extent that we can in the short term, and this will be our main focus over the coming year. Digitalisation of the REC services and specifically the user experience of both the portal and digital REC is one example where, quick wins aside, we anticipate that it will take longer to deliver more enduring improvements because of the trade-offs that we manage. On the one hand, we want to make the most of the contracts that we have in place and to deliver value for money to you, while on the other, we recognise that enduring improvements are likely to be delivered through the re-procurement and re-platforming of better code manager services for the future. In contrast, in the case of the inquiry services, if our existing service providers can make us compelling offers for service improvement and future proofing with value added offers, then we will renegotiate and extend these rather than going to re-procurement. The P1 switching service incident last year, which caused detriment to many industry parties and end consumers, is an example where we believe that the regulatory change is needed. The incident taught us that we do not have the appropriate regulatory or commercial levers to ensure the consistent service delivery that you, our parties, and end consumers expect or need. We will continue to work constructively with our service provider to deliver short-term improvements to the switching service. That said, we welcome Ofgem's consultation of the potential transfer of the switching service to RECCo, and our initial assessment is that the case for change has merit, and on this basis we will make the case for it to you and ask for your support. At RECCo, we have a dedicated team of experts who listen to our stakeholders and who want to deliver better outcomes for the retail energy industry and ultimately the end consumer. Our recent experience has taught us that we are doing many things right and that we need to improve. We are mindful that we live in difficult times and that every penny we spend has to be spent well in delivering our mandate. For that reason, we will focus over the coming year on 4 key priorities. Moving on, please. Our 4 key priorities for the coming year are a continuation of what we've been doing this year. It will come as no surprise to you that delivering service excellence will be our first priority. We'll focus in 3 main areas: code managed services, energy inquiry services, and switching services. Specifically in the code manager services space, we will improve the REC change process, the user experience of our digital platforms, and the efficacy of performance assurance, as well as our overall communication, while setting the foundations and commencing the re-procurement for the code manager service. For energy inquiry services, as I've already mentioned, we'll look to improve and future-proof the services with our existing service providers, retaining the option to procure if their proposals require us to do so. And for the switching service, we will seek performance improvement in light of the P1 switching incident and make the case for the operation of switching service to be transferred to RECCo. Elizabeth Lawler will go into the detail of what we plan to do in the delivering service excellent area. Our second priority is in data and digitalisation, where we will be building on the data and digitalisation strategy we published last year. In data, we will continue on our journey of making REC-controlled data and, to the extent possible, broader retail energy data more accessible. In digitalisation, we will start implementing the enabling systems architecture and specifically an API gateway that will facilitate the foundations for a better and more flexible service. Tracy Hardy will cover our plans in data and digitalisation. Our third priority is addressing energy theft and the energy theft reduction strategy. John Dixon will explain how we will move from the options analysis of this year to the more concrete deliverables of the coming year, helping everyone in the industry to tackle the safety and financial challenges of energy theft. Our fourth key priority is delivering on all our regulatory programs and policy delivery initiatives. A significant deliverable here will be our contribution to the MHS programme, and John Hawkins, who is leading our efforts, will cover what we plan to do in keeping up the pace of change and delivery on MHHS. John Dixon will then be covering the other initiatives, including preparing for code reform, delivering on levelisation, making the TPI Code of Conduct mandatory, as well as other watching briefs. In summing up, you have a commitment that everything we do and everyone at RECCo and all our service providers are here to serve you, to listen to you, and to maintain or achieve the high levels of service that you and our consumers expect. We have built a strong team at RECCo and have strengthened our partnerships across all service providers. It is our intention over the coming year to continue to strengthen. With your support, together, I'm confident that we can rise to the challenges and the opportunities which the next 3 years of the Forward Work Plan will present to all of us in serving a better retail energy market and in delivering better consumer outcomes. With that, I'd like to thank you and hand over to Elizabeth, who will now focus in more detail on our plans in delivering service excellence. Thank you.
Thank you, Sid. Good morning, everyone. As Sid said, my name is Elizabeth Lawler. I'm RECCo's Director of Operations. The RECCo operations team is responsible for the delivery of all of the RECC services. And if we can just move on to the next slide, please, Jenny. Thank you. This just sets out what those services are. So it's our job to make sure that our service providers meet their code and contractual obligations, that they deliver them to the required quality standards that you expect, and that we can implement the necessary changes and enhancements to meet user needs. We know that you rely on these services to discharge your regulatory obligations. Our job is to make sure that you get the service that you expect, that you need, to the required quality standard, and that the services are accessible and easy to use. And as Sid said in his introduction, we know that changes are required in these areas. We know that these services are the foundation, not just of delivering our own Forward Work Plan, but also for delivering the wider programme of industry change. And therefore, our focus this year is on delivering service excellence. That's planned continued improvement. We've got improvement plans in place that I'll talk you through in a bit more detail, but also longer term activities to make sure that these services remain fit for purpose as we move into the future. We can move on to the first of the services that I want to focus on in detail today. Thank you. Okay, so this is the Code Manager service. So the responsibility to deliver the Code Manager service sits with RECCo, and we expect that to be formalised in licence as part of Ofgem's wider package of code reform. Our operating model means that we outsource the delivery of these services, currently with 3 service providers that collectively make up the Code Manager. It said last year we conducted extensive stakeholder engagement to gather your views on the performance of the services now and also what you'll be looking to into the future. And thank you for everyone that participated in those sessions. Hopefully what you'll see as we build up this picture of change is that we've taken those views into account, been listening very carefully to the feedback we've received to understand the improvements that you need to see made. And what we've done is we've put those into different categories. So we've identified some short-term improvements that we'll be taking forward now. Plans are already being agreed with our service providers in track for the first half of this year. So we've got those robust improvement plans. And then we're also looking at how we can evolve things in the longer term to get the best value and most reliable service for you. The improvement plans what's the right word, contain two different elements. So it's not just focusing on the negatives, there are things that we need to fix, but also where we've received positive feedback, making sure that we really kind of boost in those areas. As you can see on the slide, there's some specific areas that we want to focus on. Change process. Change obviously sits at the heart of the code. It's really important that you have a change process that you find easy to interact and engage with. So we've increased the number of forums for discussion to discuss pre-changes and also the assessment and development of changes as they progress. A greater focus, and it is always a balance, on the timeliness, the speed through which changes move through, but also the quality to make sure that we get the right outcomes as they go through the process. So really working with the code manager to think about the best way to achieve that balance. And then also making sure that from a stakeholder's perspective, you can engage with the process. But if you're not engaging on a regular basis, you can keep up to speed easily and track and find a transparent way to see how those changes are progressing. And we're looking at potential changes we can make through the portal around a digital change hub. Speaking about the portal and digital navigator, many of you have been feeding into our user experience project that we've kicked off to really make sure that all of the RECC digital services are easy to engage with and you can get the information you need in the most straightforward customer journey. Performance assurance, we recognise that performance assurance is an area of concern for parties. Through the events that I attended in the summer, it was very clear to me that it wasn't a blanket no to performance assurance. Most people understand the benefit of having a regime in place. I think the challenge that we have is making sure that that's targeted in the right areas and that you are seeing the benefit of that, and in particular that we're able to drive the right consumer outcomes. So that's where we'll be focusing. That's where we've had the biggest areas, I think, of areas for improvement. And in terms of positive feedback we've received, our operational account managers continue to receive incredibly good feedback. It's become really clear to me that whilst people are happy to use digital services and kind of have a self-serve principle, you continue to really value the expertise of specialist individuals that you can speak to when you want to dig deeper into particular issues. So last year we expanded the scope of the operational account managers to include our mem parties, and this year we'll be looking to boost that service more with increased resource and potentially an expansion of scope as well. If we move on then, journey, I'm jumping ahead of myself now. So what I've spoken about there is around our sort of short-term improvements, thank you. But we also need to look at the longer-term picture. So the initial term of the code manager contract runs out in 2024. We have the option to extend that contract further. At the moment, we're looking at how can we balance those short-term improvements that we want to make with our longer-term evolution strategy. We're speaking with the code manager service providers, and we'll also be coming out to engage with you again to understand what the future of those services look like. We want to do those two things in parallel so that we can make sure that we can get the best approach for the future delivery of those services. So that's our work on the code manager package for this year, and that's being led by John Hawkins. And now we can move on to the next one, thank you, which is around the inquiry services. So again, when we came out last year to speak to you, we got some really valuable insights on the energy inquiry services, both the gas and the electricity. As Sid mentioned, feedback against these services is normally very good. Parties are generally happy with the service that they require. We recognise that these are key services. They support multiple processes used by thousands of users on a daily basis. And what we've recognised is that whilst the standard of service that you're receiving is broadly satisfactory, broadly happy with that, it's also become really clear to us that there's quite a lot of change going on in this area. So changes in user behaviours, changes in the requirements are quickly evolving and probably moving on from the service that we inherited a couple of years ago and the specifications that are set out in the RECC. And that's where we're focusing our attention. So in particular, talking about the demand and capacity requirements, and the performance levels of the APIs, we know that these areas require improvement to support essentially the evolving industry and business use cases. So our plan for this year in relation to the inquiry services is we're working with the current service providers to take forward these options, to look at how we can improve these aspects, to consider the strategic changes we need to make to really future-proof the services and really ensure that we've got the most robust technical solutions in place. We want to be able to scale the services more intuitively and rapidly into the future. In terms of a sort of contractual and commercial perspective, so the current term, the initial term of these contracts expires in 2025. So we're working now with our service providers. We've got time to explore the options that are available in terms of technology developments and make sure that we can really future-proof the inquiry services. We move on, please. So the final area I wanted to speak to you about today was the switching arrangements, and Sid's already alluded to some of the work that we're doing in this area. So switching arrangements, central switching service, central registration service, the CRS. It's obviously a key part of the REC, a key element of the services that we govern. As RECCo, we don't have direct responsibility or control for the delivery of the CRS, but we are, as far as we're able, committed to making sure the service delivers what you need. And so from an operational perspective, we're working collaboratively with the DCC to ensure that market participants receive that best level of service. And to give you some sort of examples of the things that we are able to do and that we do. So DCC is responsible for the provision of the budget for the CRS. We go through an exercise with the RECCo board, working with DCC each year to scrutinise that budget to make sure that we're driving as far as we can value for money in the service. We're pushing changes through the code to help the switching operator to make customer-focused decisions when it comes to changes that need to be made, that they benefit industry as a whole. And we're also working with DCC now around change and the governance framework for change to be able to move changes through more quickly and to the required quality standard through that DCC change pipeline. So that's what we can do. That's what the space that we're operating in. We move on to the next slide, and Sid has spoken to this briefly already. So the delivery of CRS differs from the way that we deliver the code manager services or the inquiry services that we've just been speaking about. With those two services, RECCo has the obligation to deliver the service, and then we contract commercially with specialist service providers to do that. You'll be aware that under the current regulatory model, DCC has the obligation to deliver the CRS through license, and the operating arrangements sit within the REC. That means that as RECCo, we don't have any direct commercial relationship with the DCC. They're a party to the code, and therefore we have a limited ability to have a say in any kind of evolution of the service or to direct improvements to it. And we found that that's quite limiting in terms of being able to drive the changes that we recognise are needed. So as part of the wider DCC licence review, Ofgem's obviously been out speaking to parties and stakeholders, and both Ofgem and respondents to the DCC licence consultation identified the transfer or the possibility for the transfer of responsibility for the CRS to RECCo. That would align it with our existing delivery model. We expect Ofgem to consult in the spring of this year further on that potential transfer, as we've been carrying out an initial piece of work to look at the benefits of that change and the sort of feasibility of such a transfer should that happen. That analysis has taken a range of factors into account. We've looked at regulatory perspective, we've looked at operational delivery, service delivery, and of course the commercial factors. We've assessed potential timings for, recognising the wider programme of industry work that's going on, but also recognising that we want to be able to realise any benefits as quickly as possible. And against each of those variables, we've been assessing the benefits and risk at each stage in that process. All of that's come together in a documented high-level strategic outline case. And essentially where that takes us to is we recognise that there are weaknesses in the current model, and we recommend that transfer of responsibility for the delivery of the CRS to RECCo in September 2025 would allow us to realise these benefits that we've put on the slide here, but also deliver them in the optimum time frame. So what's happening right now and between now and sort of this spring consultation is that Ofgem has asked us, and also DCC, we're talking together to provide some analysis to support the options that may be taken forward. So we're carrying out that activity In parallel, we're also doing our own due diligence work. That's going to involve engagement with stakeholders. We recognise that this is a topical area for discussion. I'll be really keen to come and understand your views on what you think might be the best way forward here. And then we're also looking to develop a credible transition and implementation plan, such that if the cases for change is evident, then we'll be able to transfer in a least risk option. Those were the key points that I wanted to make to you today. I know Sid made this point earlier, and I want to reiterate it. I hope that you've heard through his introduction and the update that I've given you our genuine commitment to improve and evolve the services to meet your needs. We work with a great team of people here at RECCo, and also with the service providers, and you know, there is a real commitment here to getting it right for you. The key to that, obviously, is to hear what you want and need. So I'd just like to say that please do pop questions into the Q&A here, or if there's anything that you've heard today through this presentation that you'd like to discuss in more detail, then please, contact details will be provided at the end. Do get in touch. I'd love to have a further conversation with you. But for now, that is probably enough from me. So I will hand over to Tracy, who's going to run through our approach to data and digitalisation. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tracy Hardy, Interim Director of Data and Digitalisation, and I'm going to talk about our data and digitalisation plans for the coming year. In September 2023, we published our data and digitalisation strategy, which aims to improve our services in the short term and enable secure and open data in the long term. The strategy also sets out a bold ambition for how it will support energy transition for society's benefit. There are a number of key areas of this strategy that we'll continue to focus on over the coming year. The first of these areas is user experience. Can we move to the next slide, please? Since the RECCo was launched in 2021, we've utilised various avenues in order to gain feedback from our users. Through regular surveys, ad hoc conversations with users, such as those that take place with OEMs, and events like our RECCo on the Road events, and dedicated user experience workshops, like the ones that we've been running as part of our user experience discovery project. Through this feedback, we've gained insight into where improvements can be made to most enhance our users' experience of interacting digitally with the RECC. We acted on this feedback last year with the introduction of ERIN, our Energy Resource Information Network, built using artificial intelligence and natural language processing. As the first industry code to implement NLP, we can offer easily accessible information on RECC products in an efficient, clear and conversational way. If you haven't already experienced ERIN, I suggest you give it a try the next time you're looking for information on the RECC portal. ERIN supports parties in understanding their obligations without the need to trawl through massive of information. As mentioned by Elizabeth, in the coming year, through our user experience project, we will continue to use the feedback we have received to prioritise enhancements to our digital services by looking at what changes can be made which will give the biggest benefit to our users in the short term, whilst also keeping in mind our longer term vision. We've almost completed the discovery phase. Utilising a user-centred design process, we identified over 100 user feedback ideas. We will shortly be moving on to prioritising these ideas into those areas which will most positively impact our users, such as improving performance and the user interface, updating content, and simplifying navigation through the portal. We do understand that the navigation is not quite as intuitive as it could be. Following this prioritisation, the project will move into the delivery phase, where we'll be delivering using an agile approach to enable us to introduce changes in a phased manner, which will allow benefits to be experienced by users quickly and enable the project team to continuously listen and respond to user feedback on the changes delivered. The next area we will be focusing on is data access. RECCo's responsibilities provide us with a unique opportunity to be a conduit for open data within the energy market, not only allowing the data to be utilised in new low carbon innovations, but also to use it as a better way to serve consumers. As part of our data discovery work during 2023, we established a clear picture of the RECC data estate, and we created a full metadata catalogue with roles and responsibilities identified, including data controllers, metadata owners, and data processors. and data classification definitions. We identified 4 classifications: always open, which can be shared without restriction; conditionally open, can be shared with certain conditions applied; personal, can be shared with appropriate consent being obtained; and restricted, cannot be shared. As part of this work, we also created a data domain model and a data quality framework. We published the findings of our discovery work in July 2023 in our Open Data Review paper. Open data enables new products and services which will give all energy consumers and industry the ability to achieve affordability, security of supply and sustainability. Our open data discovery work enabled us to take the first steps towards improving access to RECCo controlled data via Change Proposal R118, which simplified the data access request process and enabled RECCo data to be expanded to new user group and for new valid purposes. This change proposal went live in December 2023. It also enabled us to raise Change Proposal R148, which will introduce classification-based access, enabling data items classified as always open to be made widely available without restriction, whilst ensuring appropriate controls on data items where required, ensuring fair application of data protection regulations. Over the next 12 months, we will continue to work with the code manager and industry on progressing this change proposal, and we will take the necessary steps to making always open data items easily accessible for all. And we will continue to work with industry on how data can be used to improve consumer outcomes. Next slide, please. Over the coming year, we will be introducing an API gateway, and alongside this, an API management strategy as a first step in our move towards a microservices architecture, as detailed in our data and digitalisation strategy. During 2023, we focused on understanding and documenting the RECCo technical estate to aid us in developing and delivering on our data and digitalisation strategy. When we consulted on this strategy, feedback identified that this should be one of our key priorities, which led us to our decision to focus on delivery of the API gateway during the coming year. APIs are used to access a number of RECCo services, but each currently requires a separate API without any central management or standards. There are many benefits to introducing an API gateway, and these include improved security as it will be controlled centrally, improved visibility as traffic can be seen going in and out of the API gateway, traffic management, enabling us to improve performance and resilience, simplifying the onboarding process as new users will only need to onboard once for all services, central management of our service provision, continuous improvement as changes can be rolled out seamlessly and consistently to users, and improved trust through the use of a secure and well understood technology. The introduction of the API gateway and the API management strategy will result in simplification of the code needed to interact with RECCo services. There will be an initial impact on the way RECCo services are accessed, as there will be a single point of access and a single API protocol to use to interact with RECCo services. Therefore, this will be done in phases to minimise the impact to service users and mitigate any risks to key services. We will start with lower usage services and a select set of users, and once we've fully tested and stability has been confirmed, we will transition to a higher number of users and look at when most appropriate to introduce to other services. Once the transition of all services to run through the API gateway is complete, there will be no need for further changes to RECCo service APIs by users, as these will be done seamlessly to our service users. Moving on to consumer consent. In September 2023, we published the results of our consumer consent discovery work in our consumer consent consumer focused findings paper. This paper recognised the value that consumer consent could bring in giving consumers greater control on how their data is used. This work focused on the consumer perspective of consumer consent, and we worked closely with other industry-led initiatives, such as those run by Ofgem, DESNZ and Innovate UK. Our consumer consent discovery work worked on a consumer-first approach, and we identified 5 key principles, as well as developing a number of different consumer personas that a consumer consent mechanism could be tested against, and a wide variety of use cases. RECCo supports the recommendations of the Energy Digitalisation Task Force, including the need for a consumer consent portal. During the coming year, we will continue to support Ofgem and DESNZ as they progress their data sharing in a digital future consumer consent consultation, and we will progress this as a project if we are tasked with the role of delivering a consumer consent mechanism. Thank you all for listening this morning, and please feel free to add any questions to the Q&A function. I will now hand you over to John Dixon to talk about energy theft reduction initiatives.
Thank you, Tracy. If we can move straight on to the next slide, please, Jenny. So as Sid mentioned at the beginning, theft is one of our key priorities. It has been since RECCo was set up, and I suspect will continue to be for a number of years, not just because of the scale of the problem, and we've estimated theft, albeit at December 2022, prices to be somewhere in the order of 900 million to 1.4 billion pounds as an additional cost to consumers, but it obviously presents a risk to safety as well. We're all aware of the occasional gas explosion. There are multiple fires and electrocutions caused by meter tampering and bypassing each year. So it's got to remain a key priority for the industry. That's essentially what leads to our holistic approach to this. It's not just about trying to incentivize suppliers to do different activities. We've got to continue that focus on prevention as much as anything else, and we'll touch upon the continuing activities to fund and support the Stay Energy Safe campaign in a moment. We will also continue to provide tools for suppliers to continue to detect theft on their own portfolios. But I think one of the issues we've found over the past few years, and I think most people would agree with, is the kind of fragmented approach to tackling theft is not the most helpful way to go forward. And it's only by collaboration, better sharing of data, that we can genuinely tackle this as an industry. And one of those problems, not least, is how to get other agencies outside of the industry to respond when criminal activity in particular is found. And we are seeing increasing instances of people selling bypasses and tampering as a service, if you like, going door to door doing this. So this isn't all about, the individual domestic consumers doing this in all cases, and not that there's a lot of that, but there is also kind of systemic and organised criminal activity, and we must be able to better respond to that. So I'll come on to those parts in a moment, but I think the key message to get across is that we don't believe there's a silver bullet to any of this. There's no single organisation, including RECCo, that can tackle this problem. It's only by better organising and collaborating across the industry we can really do this, and it needs a range of different tools to be developed, and that's what we plan to take forward in the coming years. We have 5 key work streams, which I'll come on to a moment. We touched upon those in the current forward work plan, and they're a continuum from last year as well. And I think it's right that we do take a kind of a multi-year approach to these things rather than thinking there's any quick wins. So we'll continue to focus on engagement with you as industry parties, raising awareness with the general public, with consumers and non-energy industry people. We'll continue to gather data and try to provide analysis and insights from that data. We will continue to focus on incentives, but as I say, recognise that they're not the silver bullet to the problem. And then ultimately, we'll try and better improve our ability as an industry to take enforcement action and other remedial actions. So if we can take the next slide, please, Jenny. So the first thing to touch upon is some old news in the sense that we have set up some dedicated forums to look at the problem of energy theft. So we have an energy theft reduction expert group that meets on a monthly basis now, that kind of acts as an advisory board, if you like, to RECCo on how to take forward its own programme of work. But as I say, not all of the actions necessarily sit with RECCo or with that group. We have to find owners outside of that group. We do have a much broader forum that we've held 2 meetings of so far. And that's involved not only the regulator, but people from external agencies, from the police, from potential service providers, data software houses, those kind of things. So again, a kind of a broad church to try and tackle the problem. So this wider engagement and raising awareness is a key part of what we're trying to do. I think going forward, the key changes we'll make to that is to make sure that energy theft reduction expert group is embedded within the RECCo governance as what we refer to as a responsible committee, i.e. it's got delegated authority to take certain decisions under the REC. We could refer change proposals to it, etc. And again, responding to feedback from stakeholders. The forum itself, whilst the kind of 6 monthly webinars are useful, the feedback suggests that they do need to be more frequent. The occasional face-to-face meeting, although we're trying to move to a more digital-based platform, it is helpful to get in a room occasionally and share learnings and knowledge that you can't necessarily do via a webinar, etc. So particularly if we're going to deliver training and future guidance, etc., we'll be looking to have more of those face-to-face meetings. In terms of awareness, as I touched upon earlier, we're continuing to fund the Stay Energy Safe campaign, which started prior to RECCo being set up in the REC. So that's continuing from the legacy codes from Decusa and SPA, which used to look after those previously, and part of that is to channel tip-offs to Crime Stoppers, and they continue to be an important source of leads as to where theft is occurring and enable the relevant suppliers or network operators to deal with it. So that will be a continuing aspect of what we do, consistent with our procurement approach and desire to always be looking to achieve best value for money. We have recently gone through a market testing and re-procurement exercise to identify who the best service providers to deliver the marketing of that Stay Energy Safe campaign would be, and we'll be ready to announce the news on that shortly in terms of who we've appointed. So again, we're not resting on our laurels and continuing with existing service providers ad nauseum. We're always looking to test the market, see whether or not there's not only a better value proposition, but new ideas that we can bring to things like marketing, etc. So we'll cover that in due course. We've also looked at whether or not we can tap into social media to a better extent than we already have. So we're aware, for instance, that there's been an awful lot of chatter on various different platforms, not only people encouraging each other not to pay their bills and the kind of freeman of the land type conversations, but even trying to sell the kind of services, if I can say that in inverted commas, that I touched upon earlier in terms of bypassing meters, etc. It's important that we as an industry are aware of those kind of communications that are happening and provide some counter messaging to it. So we're looking to build upon the insights we're gathering from that social media monitoring, make sure we can feed that into our communication strategy, but also develop some actionable intelligence on the back of it. So if we can gather enough information so we can take some direct action, we'll do that as well. I'll come on to that in a moment in terms of future enforcement as well. So if we move to the next slide, please, Jenny. Data and insights. You'd be aware that under the SPA and Decusa there was a theft risk assessment service for a while. We decided not to continue that as an industry. We needed to do something better rather than just kind of reinvent the wheel and hope it would work better this time around. We didn't launch straight into a re-procurement of an analysis risk assessment service. What we wanted to do is make sure we could be gathering the new data that should be available from things like smart meter reads, tamper alerts, etc. It's fair to say that has been a slower process than we would have liked. So we're continuing to work on that, identify the data sets that could be useful to theft detection analysis, put in place data sharing agreements to gather that data, etc. And that'll feed into a number of things. So again, not only providing insights, but potentially providing some analytical services, potentially lead generation in future. But in the nearer term, it should help inform our things like this theft estimation methodology to make sure that our estimates of the problem are continually being revised, so we can generally take stock of whether or not we're making a difference or not. One of the things that we are ready to launch shortly will be a new theft data portal. So this will be in conjunction with an organisation called DeterTech, who some of you will be familiar with, previously known as Smart Water. So they already work with the utilities in terms of trying to prevent infrastructure theft. So people who are nicking cabling and those kind of things. So that organisation already has a great track record of crime risk assessment and detection and prevention. We think they can bring an awful lot to the table above and beyond the usual data analytics and presentation through portals. They've got great working relationships with all the different police forces in Great Britain, etc. So we're hoping that that will bring some fresh insights to us. You'll be aware already that we provide the theft detection incentive scheme under the RECC. That's focused purely on suppliers currently and only for the confirmation of theft. We've been looking at how to improve incentives more generally. So it's not just about how to improve that TDIS scheme and sharpen the incentive suppliers to go out and carry out further investigations and hopefully more confirmed thefts, but whether or not there are other parties who need to be involved in the incentives regime and to plug those gaps. So we'll continue to take forward that kind of whole of system approach, and that's what we'll continue to focus on in the coming year. And then enforcement, again, I touched upon the problems that we as an industry have in engaging with the police forces, etc. Energy theft is not high on their priority list. I think we all accept that. But there is a need to take these cases somewhere. You know, we have to make sure that once we've found cases of theft, we're properly empowered to be able to do something about it. It's important that we have a credible out. So in the short term, we are focused on providing guidance to better use what's already there in terms of existing legislation, etc. There are some things that we're looking at, such as the Online Safety Act, which only came into force at the back end of 2023, and whether or not that provides any options to enable us to take down kind of harmful and illegal content on the website, as was touched on earlier. So that's something we're continuing to progress. And in the long term, we're making good progress in discussions with the City of London Police to potentially set up a dedicated energy theft unit. So those of you who are familiar with our work already on this, it follows the principles that have been established by the insurance industry, where essentially the British insurance industry set up a dedicated unit within the City of London Police to go after the fraudsters who were doing the crash for cash type situations. And that's been extremely effective. And we're hoping that we could emulate that with energy theft. So that's all I was going to touch upon in terms of theft. We did cover all of these things in greater detail at the November Energy Theft Forum. So if you go on the RECCo website, you'll find out more about it there. And so we'll provide further updates in due course. So I will hand you over to John, the other John.
Morning all. So I'm going to give a quick update on what we're doing with MHHS this year. If we can go on to the slide, thank you. So it's an important year for MHHS. It's gone very quickly from something that's happening in 5 years in the future and is ages away to it's happening next year, and implementation is due between March and June next year, 2025 at the moment. So this year is going to be quite a pivotal year in getting ready to implement the changes needed to the various RECC services and the changes required to the RECC, and prepare parties for their implementation of MHHS as well. As a quick recap, there's a number of impacts to the RECC from MHHS. The first one is the obvious one is changes implemented from MHHS that impact obligations and processes set out in the RECC. The other is changes to RECC services. So the MHHS design has a significant impact on the electricity inquiry service and the way in which it will receive data and make that available to users, and the types of data it needs to make available, as well as to some impacts to the DCC, as it has some impacts on the upstream aspect of the switching journey, and it would impact on the types of users that interact with the DCC CSS service and the capacity requirements of the service as well. In terms of RECC parties, all RECC parties trading in the electricity sector, so that's electricity suppliers, MEMS and DNOs, will need to re-qualify as part of their MHHS readiness. So we're working with RECCo to look at how we re-qualify all those parties and make sure that we're prepared to take all of those through in accordance with MHHS timescales, and that parties understand what would be involved in that process so they can make the necessary preparations. And then some of the changes there impact on things like RECC governance, where it will change the way in which we need to report for the purposes of performance assurance. It will change some aspects of the change process. And then there's a number of processes changing where guidance and such will need to be updated. So as a quick recap, those are the types of things we need to prepare for with MHHS. We're making good progress with that, and the priorities for this year I've set out on the slide here. And those are where we talk about design, the MHHS program of baseline to design. That's what everyone's working to. That's what everyone's proposing to implement. There's been significant change volumes going through the program change control process to that design that we and all of you would have been having to keep up with and make sure that we're working to the latest version of the design and considering impacts from those changes. That's starting to steady out now, but no doubt there will still be some changes coming through, particularly as we go through systems integration testing and potentially find some functional defects that might indicate a need to change the design. So we need to keep on top of that from two perspectives. One is to make sure that impacts on the RECCo are considered and any solutions to design issues that come out. And the other is to make sure that the RECCo drafting remains aligned to the current version of the MHHS design, and that's all implemented and in sync when it comes into the REC. In terms of testing, systems integration testing has started. Parties participating in that are in the final phases of completing what's known as component integration testing, which is the first preliminary phase of that, with functional testing due to start from next month. So a big focus on that this year. That's going to take us through most of this year. And the Electricity Inquiry Service is a core system participating in that, and we're working with the CNC group on making sure that that is running smoothly and that we're delivering our obligations in relation to the MHHS milestones. I mentioned code drafting, so there's been good progress on code drafting, and we're delivering that in line with the number of tranches set out by the MHHS program. That's currently due to conclude around about August this year, and then there will no doubt be any final tidy ups coming out of any changes to the design that I referenced earlier, or any final issues coming out of SIT that will need to be maintained, and then that will need to be planned for release, subject to approval from the authority through their significant code review powers. Qualification, I mentioned before, we're working with industry and RECCo fairly closely on this with the qualification working group. So there's a number of documents, some of you may be familiar, setting out exactly how this is proposed to work, that are being developed in tranches at the moment. So that's the qualification approach and plan and the qualification assessment document. So we're working on delivering the updates to that, so that gives the clear guidance to parties on what will be expected, and also working with the RECCo on the scheduling of all of the participants to make sure they're qualified at the appropriate interval based on their MHHS delivery plans. Operational readiness, I mentioned there's some impacts to governance and such. So in the year in the lead up to go live, as we're getting close, this is the point now where you kind of go into the lower level detail of the various processes. There are multiple guidance documents, operational processes that will need to change. There are some new processes coming in to the REC that we've inherited as part of MHHS that we need to stand up and make sure that it's clear how users will engage with those processes, and where there are new interactions with the change process and with performance assurance, we need to make sure that that's all considered and is ready for operation. And finally, last year we had a number of engagement sessions with industry, some through our stakeholder advisory group that we set up, some through dedicated webinars for training and education. In the lead up to go live, we're looking at the best ways that we can offer support to industry in terms of overall readiness for this, and the types of education and training event that would be useful, and considering some of the earlier points around the changes coming in through code drafting, qualification, changes to the inquiry service, change to any forms of RECCo governance. So we're actively considering the best way to take that forward and provide some informative sessions and engagements to make sure that everyone knows what's going on. And that's all I was going to say. I'll hand back over to John.
Thank you. So as Elizabeth mentioned earlier on, the Energy Act 2023 provides some new legislative underpinning for energy industry codes, including the ability to license code managers. We're expecting consultations from both Ofgem and DESNZ shortly on that. We think we're in good shape as a retail and energy code, so a lot of our arrangements were developed with regard to the early proposals from Ofgem and DESNZ in that area. So we don't expect there to be substantive changes that we need to make to the operating model, although it is important that we do continue to improve upon the services and fulfil the promises that Ofgem made of the retail energy code in terms of things like accessibility and the efficiency of the change process, etc. So it is important that we continue to have regard to and improve in those areas, but we're not expecting any fundamental changes to the way we operate. The wider code reforms may see further code consolidation, but again, we're not expecting any changes to the retail energy code itself, or at least not material ones, given that it was as itself an output of retail code consolidation. So let's hope we're not wrong on that, but we'll see the consultations shortly. So I think that covers code reforms and licensing. Move on to tariff levelisation. You'll be aware that we are developing the systems and processes that will allow for the reconciliation of monies, that will allow you as suppliers to levelise the charges to consumers for between direct debit and prepayment meter standing charges at least. This is really only phase one, I think, of Ofgem's work on this. So whilst that part of the scheme will go live on the 1st of April, Ofgem has indicated that it's looking at whether or not there should also be changes to the standing charge to incorporate things like larger allocations for bad debt, etc., and potentially in the longer term a levelisation of unit rates as well. So this could be a continual area of change, if you like. So the 1st of April is really only the first tranche of work on levelisation. If I can move on to the next slide, please, Jenny. In terms of third-party intermediaries, as Sid touched upon, we've already launched a TPI code of practice, which sets out principles around things like providing greater transparency, being clear with consumers how brokers organise their commission, etc. Trying to improve some of the bad practices that we've seen in the industry. We fully recognise the feedback that we had from previous workshops on this, and from suppliers in particular, that a voluntary code of practice can only go so far. And indeed, the TPIs themselves are keen that this be something that creates a level playing field between all of them, rather than just those who are the kind of the reputational firms, if you like, adhering to additional governance, while the bad actors ignore it. So I think moving forward to a mandatory regime is key to all of this. So we'll continue to develop that accreditation and assurance regime. We're making good progress. We expect to pursue that via a RECCo change proposal to be raised by the end of this financial year. So for 24-25, the plan would really be to take that forward to implement that new regime, subject to Ofgem signing off on that change proposal. And in terms of the watching briefs, we have an interest in priority service register primarily because the retail energy code governs the transactions between parties in terms of the handling of consumer data, and that includes the data that sits on the priority services register. It's a bit of a misnomer to refer to that as a register singular. There are several dozen of them currently, and I think that in part has led to some of the problems that we have in terms of onboarding consumers onto that PSR, and the inconsistencies in terms of what it means, what services are being offered, how the data is maintained, how it's shared, etc., etc. We put forward a proposal last year, a paper on this, to suggest that the existing inquiry services could better integrate with those priority services register and facilitate better sharing of data. We still think that's an area that could be pursued, but we're looking to see what the outcome of the current government consultation on a universal PSR might be. One of the points we're going to make in our own response is that it's a bit of a misnomer again to call that a universal PSR when it's actually just focusing on 3 of the utilities. And we feel in order to be genuinely consumer centric, it has to incorporate the third sector, potentially health and social care providers, etc. In terms of demand side response, our work on this is really about the handling of data and touching upon what Tracy was saying earlier on, to make sure that there is transparency of what data is being shared and with whom, and that the consumer can have confidence in the sharing of their own data. And in particular, if this means potentially them having to react to different price signals, their assets been engaged with, etc., that they've got trust in what people are doing with it and for what purpose, etc. So that feeds into the idea that there should be a robust and consumer-centric consumer consent process. The register of that really needs to be done with the consumer in mind, rather than the consumer being constrained in order to meet kind of system constraints, if you like. On heat networks, we've responded to the Ofgem consultation on this, so you'd be aware that Ofgem's now been designated as the regulator for heat as well. Now, in principle, that could follow an entirely different set of governance than the traditional gas and electricity arrangements. It appears that there's going to be an entirely separate heat license, for instance, and the governance arrangements under that license might be very different. Again, we think that would be a missed opportunity to better integrate things like the priority service register inquiry services, which are really kind of fuel agnostic, if you like. The consumer just knows that their house is being heated somehow, and they need to be able to get in touch with somebody when they've got a problem. We think it'd be disproportionate and inefficient, and potentially lead to consumer detriment if the heat providers had to start from scratch rather than being able to utilise what's already there. So that's the thrust of our response on that, but we're awaiting the next steps on that heat consultation. And in terms of hydrogen, you'll be aware again that this is a bit of a stop-start. It's not always clear from messages coming out of government the direction of travel on this, but the key thing from our point of view is that we need to make sure that there are no inhibitions or barriers within RECC to hydrogen taking off. It's looking like things like the hydrogen villages are going to be delayed. The one in Redcar was cancelled, etc. So not a lot of proactive work in this area, it has to be said, more of a watching brief as we've categorised them. But again, just making sure that we are keeping tabs on what's happening, doing what we can. We have, for instance, supported the work group that's been held under the Uniform Network Code, just to make sure that if there are any implications for the retail arrangements coming out of that or elsewhere, we're aware of them, we can respond to them appropriately. So again, all about trying to be proactive, making sure that we as RECCo are keeping tabs on things, doing the research, identifying any necessary changes to the REC rather than having to rely on parties to do that. I think that's all I was going to say on that, so I'll hand you back over. I think it's Brian next. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to attend the webinar today to hear our strategy, forward work plan, and the associated indicative budget that we've put together. You'll have heard my colleagues have just set out what our strategy and objectives are for the coming year. Central to those are our commitment to address those areas, service areas which require improvement, and also to continue to develop the REC and the REC services to meet future challenges and regulatory changes. We've had a number of those over the last couple of years, the MSC being one, and the levelisation that John just spoke about just a moment ago. We're very cognizant that we have an obligation to deliver secure, scalable, adaptable services. Those services need to be economic, they need to be efficient, and most importantly, they need to meet REC service user needs. And feedback over the last 12 months has identified that that hasn't been the case hasn't been the case all the time. However, we must have the right level of resources in the organisation. We must have the right level of capacity and the appropriate capability in the organisation, but also within our service providers. That being said, we're very cognizant that we're spending industry money and consumer money, and we will seek to secure enhanced value at all times. We always look to get value beyond what's included within the contract, that additional extra step. I'm very happy to say that the draft budget for next year shows a 2.6 million, 5% reduction on what we were expecting for that year. So our budget for next year, this indicative budget at this moment in time, which we will be consulting on in February when we finalise the budget, is 52.9 million. And as I said, that's a 5% reduction on what we were expecting for 24-25. So yeah, 24-25, almost lost a year there. We have achieved this reduction and this budget through a focus on core service, and I think that message has come through very strong through the presentation so far, and also on focusing on what key projects do we need to do next year to deliver our requirements. What we've also done for this coming year, as we did in the current year, is we've engaged with our service providers and we have sought to see cost reductions in service provision, most notably in the DCC CRS costs for the coming year, and we'll speak to that in a moment. I'll pause for just a moment there to allow people to drop in any questions into the Q&A that they may have. Okay. Jenny, if you could move to the next slide, please. As I said, our expected budget for next year is 52.9 million, and that's a 5% reduction on what we were expecting for that year. Our projections that we're showing over the planning period is a best estimate of resources of what we need to deliver the plan. They're not an absolute given. They are our best estimates at this moment in time. When we develop the budgets, we use a bottom-up approach. We don't just take last year's and add X percent. We start from the bottom and work up. That means that the cost estimates that we include in the budgets are specific, they're reasonable, and they are subject to scrutiny on a line-by-line basis, both within the exec, within the organisation, and also at RECCo board level. Further, they are then subject to scrutiny by industry when we go to formal consultation in February. Across the planning period, the core costs remain largely stable. There's inflationary impacts and indexation impacts, and when contracts roll out of their fixed cost period and into increases in the latter years, you can see those indexation impacts in the REC services charges. There is an uplift in year two, and we need to recognise that, and that reflects the code manager procurement impact and the timing of when the procurement will happen and the potential costs associated with our strategy in that particular service. What we have sought to do, and I think we have achieved over the last couple of years, is we have mitigated against the inflationary impacts and the significant levels of indexation and inflation that we've seen recently and the cost of living impact over the last couple of years through fixed price contracts. We have fixed price contracts in place with all of our service providers, and they are fixed for the initial term. And that initial term in most cases is 3 years. And then after that, they increase by indexation linked to CPI or CPIH for years 4 and 5 onwards. So that's the general overview. So if we look at the REC services, as my colleagues kind of highlighted earlier in the presentation, we've just completed our first full year of delivering the full suite of REC services during 2022 into 23. That was the first time we had the full suite of services that we had to deliver. While service delivery has been good overall, there is absolutely areas which require improvement, and those improvements are driven by two things, as mentioned by Elizabeth and Sid earlier today. Combinations of services needing to develop to meet changing user requirements, particularly on areas such as the inquiry services, and also some services not delivering to the quality standard that RECCo requires and that end users require. So for 24-25, our focus is going to be on improvement and building for the future. And I see in the chat there was an earlier comment from Steve regarding transformation program we're entering into, and we'll address that in the next section. I would like to say that we have secured cost reductions on CSS, and we have done that through an open and constructive dialogue with DCC. Elizabeth spoke about some of the initiatives that we've put in place beyond what is in the license and beyond what is in the REC as regards our day-to-day working relationship with DCC. And I think credit where credit is due, DCC have stepped up to the challenges that we have presented on the future cost expectations for CRS. The other area I just want to pick up here is the RECCo operations, and our resource capacity in the organisation for 24-25 is expected to grow, but albeit at a moderate level. This growth is driven by three key elements. We have looked economic factors, and we have sought to replace reliance on contractors and consultants with a move to employee capability. That delivers economic benefit to the organisation. What it also does is it retains the skills, knowledge, etc. within the organisation. What we also have to do is increase our capacity to deal with the increased delivery obligations. John spoke about tariff levelisation and the service that will go live from the 1st of this year. And what we've also then done is a moderate increase to increase our resources within the delivery teams to drive further value from our service providers. We're expecting improvement in the coming year, and we need to have the people and processes in place to achieve that. Again, I'll just take a brief pause while give people the opportunity to drop in any questions. Okay, Jenny, if we can move to the next slide, please. This slide covers those three final areas, which are projects, change allowance, and contingency. Our projects, we have prioritised those on the classic Moscow basis, the must, should, could, and won't have basis. For projects that we have classified as must-haves, they had a very clear, defined definition. They are things a RECCo must do because of either a REC obligation, a contractual obligation, or a legal obligation. They are something we have to do. The must-haves account for greater than 80% of the total project budget. The remaining 20% of our total project budget reflects supporting and enabling projects to support the must-haves. For example, the API gateway that Tracy spoke about earlier today. If we have any new regulatory requirements coming in, for example, consumer consent, where there's an obligation inserted into REC for us to do something, we would expect that to be funded from contingency, as we have done historically with the MSC and as we have done with levelisation in this year. MHHS in itself accounts for greater than 50% of our total project spend for the coming year, and that is primarily with external service providers. We will continue to invoice that separately to our REC charges because that facilitates parties being able to capitalise those costs within their own financial statements. The change allowance, we have maintained that, and we're proposing to maintain that at the expected value of 4 million for the coming year. We use that to fund REC service changes, including CSS, and Elizabeth touched on that earlier about the improvements in the process that we're putting in place to expedite those changes. We have processes internally. FAA changes raised through the REC, then it goes through scrutiny within the REC and within the code manager as to whether it delivers value for money, etc. If they are REC code driven changes, we have the same staged approach and gated approach within the organisation where all changes are subject to internal scrutiny. And finally, we've got the contingency allowance. What we have done for this year is we've removed any specific project contingencies or any contingencies in any of the individual budget lines, and we have included and maintained the company contingency at a relatively moderate value in comparison to the budget as a whole. That contingency allowance is used to hedge against any market instability, and we saw that in 2021-22, but also used to fund any new regulatory initiatives, as I mentioned earlier, the MSC stroke levelisation. And I just want to add that we're heading towards our year end, which is in 2 months' time, and we're expecting to underspend against the current year. The value of that rebate will be determined finally through our audit, which will happen in May and June time. And then we will communicate to parties what the value of that rebate is. That rebate will be returned to parties and it'll be returned as a reduction against the 24-25 charges. And now Rachel is going to share with you the future timescales for budget consultations, etc. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian, and also thank you to the rest of our speakers. So we've concluded the main speaker presentations for you today. So I'm going to quickly go over the next steps and some key dates to your diaries. Before we move on to the Q&A session, we have had a couple of questions at the moment, but please do keep them coming because we'll be addressing those in the next couple of minutes. So in terms of next steps, we're currently within a consultation process. We published our draft strategy and forward work plan on the 15th of January, and that's currently out for consultation with industry for the next 15 working days. We really do encourage your comments and your responses to the consultation, and please just to point to highlight the deadline for those responses is 5 p.m. on the 5th of February. We do have a dedicated email address for consultation responses, and that's available on the last slide of the deck today. So you can have a look at that when we send that out. Following the closure of the consultation window on the 5th of February, we will be considering any comments received today within the webinar, but also within the formal consultation process before the board publishes its final budget, which is at the end of February, and also the final strategy and forward work plan, which is towards the end of March. We'll also be collating any comments received through the consultation process and transparency, publishing those comments received and the next steps that we're taking to address any feedback. In terms of the budget, and I think Brian just alluded to this, we'll be publishing our final budget based on this consultation window on the 21st of February. We'll also be holding a dedicated budget webinar with you as our stakeholders on the 28th of February. And that's a chance again to hear our final budget and also you guys to ask any questions, and we can go in a bit more detail around any of the areas that you want to hear more on. It's worth highlighting that our final budget, which we publish in February, in line with the REC, isn't subject to formal consultation with REC parties, but rather REC parties do have a right to appeal the decision of the board to approve the published budget. So any appeals are directly made to Ofgem and need to be made to Ofgem within 10 working days of publishing the budget. And all the details and the timeframes around that are all documented within REC section 9. Following the closure of the appeal window to the budget, we'll then publish a final strategy and forward work plan at the end of March, as the slide shows. The other bit I was going to mention, and I think it helps address your comment and question, Steve, that we'll get onto in a moment. We understand that transparency and you inputting into the development of our initiatives is really key. So we've been looking at new ways to enhance our engagement and also our communications with you around our strategy and forward work plan. So one of the things that we'll be doing this year is we're introducing quarterly updates and quarterly reporting to you as our stakeholders on our forward work plan. So you can have a better understanding and how we're doing as an organisation in terms of the commitments and when we're working on certain initiatives and better how you can help inform and be involved in those initiatives as we develop through the year. So that concludes the next steps. If we could move on to the Q&A section, and if I ask all of our speakers to come back on camera, that would be brilliant. I can see that we've had a couple of questions coming in. So if we get going with those, I think the first question I can address, it was from you, Steve, a really good question. With such a broad transformation programme, how is the RECCo executive management team proposing to engage with its stakeholders? You referenced some operational routes you're engaging with at the moment, but you wanted for us to address at a strategy level what enduring engagement looks like. So like I said, really good question. Firstly, I wanted to address your reference to transformational programmes. I think how we're looking at it and how we've developed our strategy and forward work plan for the year ahead is over the next year, our focus is really on the evolution of our services. So a focus on our core services, and this is designed to address the issues raised by parties, which we've all actively sought over the past year through the various channels that we've mentioned earlier. I think in terms of your question, it's really great to hear that you're utilising some of the key engagement routes that we put in place within the Code Manager. I think it's really key to highlight that RECCo and its management team and the Code Manager, we don't work in isolation. It's a very much joint up approach between RECCo and the Code Manager and the OEMs to make sure that we deliver the forward work plan with our code managers, and any feedback that our code managers and the OEMs receive in terms of stakeholder feedback is very much shared with RECCo, and this really does inform the next steps of RECCo and the decisions that we make. I think in terms of broadly around engagement, annually we create a stakeholder engagement plan which we work up with the board, and this very much guides our engagements and communications over the year ahead. This includes a multi-channel approach to all of our engagements. So aside from our usual comms channels, which hopefully you guys find useful, so we have our monthly newsletter, our website, our LinkedIn account, we provide updates through the weekly code bulletin. We have separate engagement plans for all of our initiatives. So that includes the 4 strategic priority areas that we set through today. We'll be individually developing stakeholder plans in terms of when the most appropriate times and would be to engage with you, and what the channels of engagement are. So for instance, webinars will continue to be a key area and channel for our engagements. We're currently planning 5 over the next 3 months across all of our different initiatives. We also undergo consultations as one of our engagement routes. So over the past year, you would have seen, as part of developing our data and digitalisation strategy, we did various different consultations with industry to get your inputs and really guide what our strategy and our commitments are in that area. We'll also be continuing with our roadshow series over the next year. So we went out various different places around the country last year to directly speak to you, understand your feedback, your needs, your priorities, and that helped shape our priority for this year. And we'll be doing the same again this year. We'll also be, over the past year, we also set up dedicated forums and expert groups in relation to delivering our energy theft reduction strategy. We've had really good feedback on those, and we'll be building upon that approach to look at how we can use those sorts of forums, as we understand you will see them as really valuable ways of engaging with us across our other initiatives. So initially, we're already looking at setting up appropriate user forums as we progress with our Code Manager Evolution project over the next year. In terms of changes for the year ahead, other areas just to highlight, I think Elizabeth mentioned in her presentation to you guys that increasingly we want to go out and have bilaterals with you, understand your priorities, but also form better relationships with you, and also update you on our progress against our programme. So that's another area that will be bolstering onto our engagement plan for the year ahead. I think it's also just worth saying that at RECCo, we really do value your input and insights, and your priorities really do reflect what we're trying to do in our organisation in terms of our priorities. So one of the new initiatives and investments we've made in terms of engagement for the year ahead is we've just brought on board a new customer insights manager in January, and she'll really be helping us cover our strategic topics and engagements going forward with you. So Steve, I hope that's covered your question. That being said, we're always open to more feedback from parties in terms of our engagement and communication channels. So if you do have any other suggestions, please do let us know, and we're more than happy to look at introducing those over the next year and beyond. Okay, so that's the first question we've had. I think the next question we had was one for you, Brian. So the question again was from Steve. Brian, the REC services costs increased from 37.4 to 40. Can you speak to this increase year on year and above project cost changes detailed separately?
Yep. Morning, Steve. So I think I'll deal with the 34 to 37 because some of the things in there actually transfer into the subsequent years as well. As I mentioned during the presentation, we do have fixed price contracts in the initial terms of the contracts, but a number of those initial terms expire in 24-25, and consequently we do have that impact then of indexation kicking in for the second terms of those contracts. So there's an indexation impact in there. What we also have is that, and that indexation impact impacts things like the CSS cost, the code manager cost, the inquiry services, etc., etc. What we also have is an expected move in that John outlined a number of initiatives that we will be looking to do on theft. And what we've included in the allowance then is the transition of those initiatives into service delivery, essentially in year 2. So there is an uplift on theft. So the theft costs increase by, just flick over to a spreadsheet. They increased by about 1.5 million. And that's an allowance that we've put in to deal with potential theft services in whatever form they would take. Then the move from year 2 from the 37 to the 40, again, there's that indexation impact. What we're also expecting is there's a sort of double impact of indexation. We're expecting to go to procurement of the code manager services. What we're also expecting is that in that procurement, those costs are likely to increase, reflecting the assumption that over the previous 5 years, day rates, cost of living impact, etc., that has driven up day rates. Everything is indicated in things like the Financial Times that the cost of professional services are increasing. So over that period, there's an impact of new allowances for new services coming in. So, for example, also things like the API gateway that Tracy spoke about, that moves from a project into a service once we've initialized it, put it up, and then it becomes a service cost plus the indexation costs. Hopefully that's answered your question. Hopefully I get a thumbs up. Rachel got a thumbs up. Oh, there it is.
And a heart.
Oh, fantastic.
So thanks, Brian.
We don't do a thumbs down.
Next question we've had is from Eric. So hi, Eric. Question I think is for you, Elizabeth. What work are you envisaging being done under the CRRS transfer budget line?
Okay. Morning, Eric. Thanks for your question. As I said earlier, Ofgem has identified the potential for the transfer of the responsibility from the CRS from DCC to RECCo and planning to consult in the spring. I think we're in the same position that you are, essentially. I know that they've spoken to you. They've asked us, like they've asked you, to do some analysis of the options. Our initial analysis, we've started some work already, indicates that we think there is a real benefit here and an opportunity that we want to explore in more detail. And so it's prudent that we do that analysis and carry out some due diligence to develop a plan to understand that if this is to happen, if there is the case that we can make for it, how that would happen and the best way to deliver it. That's an additional activity for us. We don't currently have a team working on those sorts of things, so I think it's entirely appropriate that we recognise this within the budget and a transparent and including an allowance to do that analysis of the options, and due diligence is probably the best way to capture it, and recognising that budget is only spent and that work only continues if there's a decision to move forward in that way. So in the same way for RECCo, we don't incur additional costs unless we've got a strong basis on which to do so, and so that's the approach that we'll be applying to this one also. Thank you,
Elizabeth. Hopefully that answered your question, Eric. We do have one more question, so there's still a chance to ask your questions, guys. We do have another 25 minutes scheduled for today's session, so any final questions, please do put them in the Q&A function. The next question we had, again, Brian, another finance question for you. Why will the underspend be taken off the 24-25 invoice and not refunded to parties?
Good morning, Kathy. It will be refunded to parties, but the means of the refund is that we take it off the invoice when we raise an invoice. So if we say the budget is 50 million for want of ease of reference, that's essentially we would invoice 12.5 million each quarter. And let's say the refund for 23-24 is 5 million. One of those invoices, we will raise the invoice. It'll show 12.5 million, but we will also include a credit within that invoice, so we will knock off the 5 million off it. So we're returning the money in that way. We do it like that because that ensures that we comply with things like VAT legislation. So we ensure that the VAT is properly accounted for. We also have to distribute the money in proportion to the party's share of the RECC cost for 23-24 rather than their share of the cost for 24-25, reflecting any movement in the market shares over that period of time. What it also means is that we then don't have to get each party to raise an invoice to RECCo, that we would have to communicate to parties and say, we need you to invoice RECCo this amount of money and please make sure you have VAT on it. The way that we do it, where we essentially knock it off against an invoice, that's historically the way that's been done. It was done under the MRA, it was done under SPA, I think is the way that CUSA do it, and I think it may be the way that Elexon does it as well. But ultimately, the money is going back to parties, and we get it back as soon as we possibly can. Hopefully that's answered the question.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. So
we don't currently have any more questions. Another thumbs up, that's a good sign. Kathy, you put your hand up. Is there something that you want to raise? Oh, I think it's gone down now. Okay, I take the thumbs up as a sign that Brian answered your question. So we don't have any more questions I can see that have come in. So on that note, I think we'll draw the webinar to an end. If you do have any questions and you haven't had the chance for whatever reason to raise them today, please do contact us individually or using our dedicated strategy help desk email address, which will be available on the last slide of the slide today. I just wanted to say a really big thank you for taking your time out of all your busy schedules to join us for today's webinar, and we really hope you found it useful. Jenny's launched a poll to get your feedback. It should pop up in the chat function for you, just so we can have a good indication on how useful you found it was, and if you've got any suggestions for our future webinars, that would be really helpful for the team. So if you have time to answer that short poll, that would be really appreciated. In terms of next steps, again, the next time you'll be hearing from us will be on Thursday when we circulate the post-meeting documents from today's webinar. That'll include the slides, the recording from today, and the collation of the questions and responses from the team. In the meantime, please do reach out if you have any questions or if you'd like to speak to any of the team on anything that we've mentioned today. Like, we are here to speak to you and answer any questions that you have. In terms of our next engagement within this process, it'll be our dedicated budget webinar, and that's on the 28th of February. So that's all from me and the rest of the team. I hope everyone has a good rest of the day and speak soon. Thanks, everyone.